Why would 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of a tent in the middle of a frozen night, flee into darkness wearing almost nothing, and never return? On February 26, 1959, a search party stood before a scene that defied comprehension. The tent was half buried in snow on the slope of Kalatsiek, Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language. Someone had slashed it open from the inside. Long, deliberate cuts through canvas. And beyond those cuts, leading down into the white expanse below, a trail of footprints stretched toward the tree line. Some prints were bare feet, others showed only socks. The temperature that night had been minus 30 degrees Celsius, perhaps colder with the wind. This is the story of what happened on Dead Mountain. Not the mythology that grew around it, not the conspiracy theories that would echo for decades, but the documented evidence, the verified facts, and the most credible explanations we have for one of the 20th century's most haunting mysteries. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back 3 weeks earlier, to the beginning of January 1959 in the city of Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, in the Soviet Ural Mountains. 10 young people gathered at the train station. They were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, and they shared a passion that defined Soviet youth culture of that era: hiking. Not casual day trips, but serious mountaineering expeditions into some of the harshest terrain in Russia. They called themselves tourists, but this word meant something different in the Soviet Union. It meant endurance. It meant a relationship with the wild places that bordered on reverence. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a radio engineering student with sharp features and intense eyes. He'd been planning this expedition for months, a route through the Northern Urals to Ottorten Mountain, a journey of roughly 200 miles through winter wilderness. If completed, it would earn them all-grade Roman III certification, the highest level of achievement in Soviet mountaineering. This wasn't a group of naive adventurers. These were skilled outdoorsmen and women who understood cold, understood snow, understood what the mountains demanded. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, geology student, experienced hiker. Friends called her Zina. Rustam Slobodin, 23, engineering student, known for his humor and guitar playing. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, economics student, powerfully built. Yuri Yudin, 21. He would become the most important member of the group, though he couldn't have known it then. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, economics student, fierce and determined. Alexander Kolvatov, 24, the quietest of the group. Georgy Krivonishenko, 23, who worked at a nuclear facility and had been recently cleared after a minor radiation exposure incident. Nikolai Thiboksbrignol, 23, with a French surname and Russian heart. And finally, Semyon Zolotaryov, 37, older than the others by over a decade, a decorated World War II veteran who'd asked to join the expedition at the last moment. He brought his camera. He'd brought cameras on every trek. 10 people boarded the train heading northeast. The plan was straightforward: travel by train to Ivdel, then by truck to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement. From there, they would trek on skis through pristine wilderness, camping as they went until they reached Ottorten and returned. They expected to be back by February 12th. They'd built in extra time for delays, weather, the usual complications of winter travel. Journey began smoothly. On January 25th, they reached Vizhai and spent the night with locals who would later remember them as cheerful, well-prepared, confident. The next morning, they hired a truck to take them further north to the beginning of the unmapped wilderness. On January 27th, they started skiing. The group kept a communal diary, taking turns writing entries. The early pages are filled with the ordinary details of expedition life: the weight of their packs, the quality of the snow, small jokes between friends. Zina wrote about the cold. Rustam sketched the landscape. They documented their progress with photographs, images that would later be recovered and developed, showing young faces squinting against bright snow, tents being raised, campfires crackling in clearings. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin made a decision that would save his life. Pain had been building in his leg, an old injury flaring up. He knew he couldn't continue and the group couldn't afford to slow down for him. It was a reasonable decision, a mature decision. His friends saw him off with embraces and jokes, promising to see him in 2 weeks. He turned back toward civilization. He would be the only survivor. Now there were 9. The group continued north, following the Lozva River Valley, then turning east. The terrain grew more challenging. The forests thickened and then began to thin as they climbed higher. They were entering the gap between tree zones, where the elevation strips away the protective cover of pines and exposes the mountains to full weather. On February 1st, they made a decision that still puzzles analysts. Instead of following the valley and staying in the relative shelter of the forest, they turned toward Khalat Siek, Dead Mountain, and began ascending its slope. The plan had been to cache supplies at the forest edge and summit from there, but for reasons documented only partially in their final diary entries, they chose to make camp on the exposed mountainside itself. Perhaps they wanted to save time. Perhaps they underestimated the mountain. Perhaps Igor Dyatlov, experienced as he was, made a simple error in judgment. At approximately 5 in the afternoon, as light was failing and wind was rising, they began setting up their tent on the slope. It would be the last thing they ever built. The tent was a standard Soviet model, large enough for the group but not designed for extreme elevation. They pitched it by cutting into the snow, creating a platform, anchoring it against the slope. The wind would have been brutal up there. No trees to break its momentum. Just open mountainside and the dark mass of forest more than a mile below. They ate dinner. The remains would be found later: dried bread, canned goods. Someone made entries in the diary, though these final pages would be difficult to interpret. One member, likely Zolotaryov, wrote a satirical evening paper that joked about their situation. Humor in the face of discomfort, a normal thing for experienced hikers. At some point, they settled in for the night, 9 people in a tent built for warmth through proximity. They would have been wearing lighter clothes inside, reserving their heavy outer layers for morning. Standard practice. You don't sleep in your dampened outer gear. And then, sometime between the evening of February 1st and the early hours of February 2nd, something happened. We know this because of what was found 3 weeks later. The search party that discovered the tent on February 26th found it partially collapsed under snow but still standing. The entrance faced downslope, and the entire side facing uphill, the side that bore the brunt of the wind, had been cut open from the inside. Multiple slashes long enough for a person to crawl through. Not tears, cuts made with knives. The tent's contents were still inside: boots, coats, personal belongings. A flashlight left on the tent's surface, its battery dead, but positioned as though someone had placed it there deliberately. Another flashlight further down the slope, also exhausted, and the footprints. This detail would haunt investigators. The prints led downslope in a relatively organized trail. Not scattered in panic, but purposeful. 8 or 9 sets of tracks. Some showed bare feet. Others showed feet covered only in socks or torn pieces of clothing wrapped for minimal protection. A few wore felt boots, valenki, traditional Russian winter footwear but not adequate for deep cold. The tracks continued for over 1,500 meters, nearly a mile. Down the exposed slope, down toward the forest edge where the dark cedar trees began. Then the tracks disappeared into the deeper snow beneath the tree line. The search party followed them into the woods. At the forest edge, they found the first bodies. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found another 150 meters further up, closer to the tent. She too was positioned as though climbing back. Her hands showed signs of severe frostbite. She'd made it partway before the cold took her. Rustam Slobodin was found between them, also oriented toward the tent. He had a small skull fracture, not severe enough to be immediately fatal but present. All 3 had died from hypothermia. This created a timeline of sorts. The group had fled the tent. They'd reached the forest. 2 had stayed by the cedar trying to build a fire. Others had attempted to return, whether to retrieve supplies or because they believed the threat had passed, we don't know. But 5 bodies accounted for only half the group. 4 were missing. Search continued through February and into March. Snow melted slowly at that elevation. The forest held its secrets. Search parties combed the area, prodding through snow with poles, following the drainage patterns, looking for any sign. On May 4th, nearly 3 months after the incident, they found the remaining 4. They were in a ravine, 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow. They'd been there the entire time, hidden beneath winter's accumulation. But unlike the others, these 4 were partially dressed in clothes that hadn't been theirs originally. Lyudmila Dubinina wore Krivonishenko's pants. Zolotaryov wore Dubinina's faux fur coat. Pieces of Doroshenko's clothing were distributed among them. The clothing had been cut away, torn from the bodies of those who died first and redistributed to those who still lived. They'd been trying to survive, but the injuries found on these 4 bodies raised questions that would echo for decades. Lyudmila Dubinina's chest showed massive trauma. Ribs fractured, not 1 or 2, multiple fractures creating what's called a flail chest, and her tongue was missing. The autopsy noted the tongue and surrounding tissue had been absent, the damage described as potentially occurring perimortem around the time of death. Semyon Zolotaryov had similar chest trauma, severe rib fractures, multiple. The medical examiner noted the force required would be substantial, comparable to a severe car accident. Nikolai Thiboks-Brignol had a catastrophic skull fracture. Alexander Kolvatov showed less severe injuries, but was found with the others. The medical examiner who performed the autopsies made a statement that would fuel speculation for decades. The force required to create these injuries was significant, yet there was no corresponding external trauma. No cuts, no bruises on the skin where you'd expect them. The damage was internal, as though they'd been subjected to an extreme pressure, or a powerful, blunt force that left no mark. The investigation officially concluded in May 1959. The final determination was vague. A compelling natural force had caused the deaths. The case was closed. The files were sent to a secret archive, and the questions began. For 60 years, investigators, scientists, and enthusiasts have tried to answer a single question. What was the compelling natural force? To understand the theories, we first need to examine the details that made this case so persistently strange. Not the sensationalized mythology that grew around it, but the documented anomalies that appear in official records, autopsy reports, and witness statements. Let's start with the tent. The cuts were made from inside. This is undisputed, but the nature of those cuts matters. They weren't wild slashes of panic. Photographs show deliberate vertical cuts through the canvas, large enough to climb through. Some investigators have noted that the pattern suggests people cut their way out to exit quickly, but not in absolute chaos. It was purposeful escape. Why not use the entrance? That question has never been satisfactorily answered. The entrance was partially blocked by snow but not impossible to access. Yet every member chose to cut through fabric rather than dig out the front. This suggests urgency but also suggests the threat, whatever it was perceived to be immediate and directional. Coming from the entrance side, perhaps, or from above. The footprints tell their own story. Investigators noted they were relatively orderly, not the scattered prints of pure panic, but a group moving together downslope. Some reports mention that certain prints appeared to show people walking calmly, even slowly. Others suggested hurried movement. The prints continued in formation for that entire mile to the forest edge. One detail often overlooked: there were no signs of returning prints before the 3 who died trying to climb back. Meaning the group descended together, stayed at the cedar together, and then some made the decision to return. The snow had likely covered earlier tracks, but it suggests a coherent sequence of events rather than pure chaos. Then there's the clothing distribution. The fact that survivors cut clothing from their dead companions is not mysterious in itself. It's survival instinct. But it indicates time passage. It means some members lived long enough after the initial incident to attempt practical measures. They had moments of clear thinking. They made decisions. Lyudmila Dubinina was found with Krivonishenko's woolen pants, his jacket. Zolotaryov wore pieces from multiple people. This wasn't done in the first minutes of panic. This was done after the fire attempt, after some had already succumbed to the cold, after the survivors realized they needed more protection. Which brings us to the injuries. The medical examiner was Boris Vozrezhdeny, an experienced forensic pathologist. His reports are detailed and professional. He documented what he saw without speculation, and what he saw puzzled him. The 2 Urals at the cedar, hypothermia, minor burns, some cuts consistent with climbing and moving through forest, nothing unusual for their situation. The 3 found on the slope, hypothermia, minor injuries. Rustam Slobodin's skull fracture was small, a linear fracture that wouldn't have incapacitated him immediately. He could have walked with that injury. All 3 appeared to have simply frozen while trying to return. But the ravine 4. Dubinina's chest injuries showed 8 fractured ribs. The fractures were bilateral on both sides. The medical report noted that the force required would be extremely significant and compared it to impacts seen in high-speed vehicle accidents. Zolotaryov had 5 fractured ribs, also bilateral. Thibault-Brignol's skull fracture was described as a depressed comminuted fracture, a crushing injury that would have caused immediate unconsciousness, possibly death. Yet here's what made these injuries strange. There was minimal external trauma. Bruising was noted, yes, but not the kind of surface damage you'd expect from blunt force. No lacerations, no massive contusions. The skin was largely intact. Vozrezhdeny noted this explicitly. He wrote that the injuries were caused by a high level of pressure, and that they had characteristics of a blast wave or extreme compressive force. Not blows, not impacts from falling, pressure. And then there's Dubinina's missing tongue. The autopsy report states that the tongue, hyoid bone, and surrounding soft tissue were absent. Vozrezhdeny noted this could have occurred perimortem around the time of death, but also acknowledged that decomposition and scavenging could account for it. The body had been under snow and running water for 3 months. Soft tissue decomposes. Scavengers target mouths and eyes first. Yet this detail became one of the most sensationalized aspects of the case, twisted into evidence of something sinister. We need to separate what is genuinely strange from what can be explained by natural processes. Strange. The tent cuts, the flight into deadly cold, the severe internal injuries without corresponding external trauma. Explainable. The missing tongue through decomposition, the clothing distribution through survival attempts, the fire and cedar climbing through desperate cold. There were other details that entered the mythology but deserve scrutiny. Reports of orange lights in the sky that night. These came from witnesses miles away, reported weeks or months after the fact. The Urals were, and are, a military testing area. Rockets, flares, and atmospheric phenomena occurred regularly. The Soviet military conducted tests in the region. Orange lights prove nothing specific. Radiation found on some clothing. Krivonishenko worked at a nuclear facility and had documented contamination exposure before the trip. The radiation levels detected were low and localized to specific garments. Not evidence of a nuclear event, but consistent with prior occupational exposure. The diary entries. The final pages showed normal expedition documentation. There was one satirical evening paper written by someone, likely Zolotaryov, that made jokes about their cold situation. Nothing suggested fear or premonition. The closed investigation. The Soviet Union routinely classified cases that touched on military areas, embarrassed the state, or simply couldn't be neatly resolved. The Urals were militarily sensitive. The fact that the case was archived doesn't imply conspiracy. It implies bureaucratic standard procedure. So what are we left with? 9 experienced hikers fled their tent in deadly conditions and died within hours, some from exposure, some from traumatic injuries that suggest a powerful external force. They didn't return for their equipment even though their survival depended on it. They made rational decisions, building a fire, redistributing clothing, which suggests they weren't in a state of complete psychological breakdown. Something drove them from that tent, something immediate and terrifying enough that cutting through canvas and running into -30-degree cold seemed like the better option. The question is, what could create that scenario? Over the decades, dozens of theories have emerged, some credible, some fantastical, some based on genuine scientific investigation, others on speculation and cultural mythology. Let's examine the major explanations, weighing each against the documented evidence. The avalanche hypothesis. This is perhaps the most straightforward explanation, and it has gained significant traction in recent years. In 2021, a team of scientists from Switzerland and Russia published a study modeling snow slab dynamics on the slope of Khalat Siak. Their conclusion: a delayed slab avalanche could have struck the tent hours after it was pitched. Here's how this theory works. The group cut into the slope to create a platform for their tent. This cutting destabilized the snow layer above them. The wind was strong that night, documented in weather records, which would have added load to the snow slab. Hours after they settled in, possibly in the middle of the night, a section of compacted snow released and struck the tent with significant force. Not a massive avalanche that would bury them completely, but a localized collapse. Enough to cause the internal injuries found on Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thiboksbrig Knoll. Enough to create panic. The theory explains the tent cuts. Trapped by collapsed canvas and snow, unable to find the entrance quickly, they cut their way out in darkness. It explains the flight without proper clothing. Avalanche survivors often describe disorientation and the overwhelming urge to escape the burial zone. It explains why they didn't return. In darkness and cold, perhaps they couldn't locate the tent again, or feared another collapse. The 2021 study even explained why no avalanche debris was found. Small slab avalanches can be covered by subsequent snowfall and wind within days, leaving minimal evidence. Strengths of this theory. It accounts for the severe chest trauma through compressive force. It explains the urgency. It requires no exotic phenomena. Weaknesses. Experienced hikers would have recognized avalanche terrain. The slope angle was marginal for avalanche risk, between 15 and 25 degrees, lower than typical avalanche slopes. And witnesses reported no avalanche debris at the scene, though this could be explained by time and weather. The infrasound hypothesis. This theory emerged from research into acoustic phenomena in mountainous terrain. Under certain wind conditions, air moving over irregular terrain can create infrasonic frequencies, sound waves below the threshold of human hearing, typically below 20 Hz. Humans cannot consciously hear infrasound, but the body responds to it. Studies have documented effects: anxiety, dread, disorientation, panic, even hallucinations, the feeling of presence, the conviction that something is wrong. In 2000, researcher Donnie Ikar investigated this possibility after consulting with scientists studying wind patterns in the Urals. The theory suggests that powerful winds on the night of February 1st created infrasonic waves that induced psychological terror in the group. Unable to identify the source of their panic, but feeling overwhelming dread, they fled. This would explain the tent cuts, irrational fear driving them to escape immediately. It would explain why they left without clothing. Panic overrides logic. It would explain the organized descent. They moved together because the fear was shared. Environmental strengths. Infrasound has been demonstrated to cause intense psychological effects. The wind conditions were documented. The behavior pattern fits panic response. Weaknesses. It doesn't explain the physical injuries. Infrasound causes psychological distress, not crushed ribs and skull fractures. unless the panic caused them to fall, to injure themselves in the ravine, but that requires additional assumptions, and experienced hikers would likely have weathered psychological discomfort rather than flee into certain death. The military hypothesis. The Northern Urals were, and remain, a testing ground for Soviet, now Russian, military operations. In 1959, the area saw regular rocket tests, parachute drops, and other classified activities. One version of this theory suggests the group witnessed or was caught near a military test. Perhaps a rocket malfunction, perhaps a weapons test. The orange lights reported in the sky that night could have been flares, missiles, or other ordnance. Under this scenario, military personnel might have found the group, removed evidence, or the group fled from perceived military danger. Some versions suggest the chest injuries could have resulted from a pressure wave from an explosion or shock front. Strengths. The region was militarily active. The case was classified. Some clothing showed traces of radiation, though low level. Weaknesses. No direct evidence of military involvement has emerged despite extensive investigation. The radiation levels were consistent with prior occupational exposure, not weapons testing. The injuries don't match typical blast patterns, and Soviet military records, now accessible, show no incidents in that area on those dates. The hypothermia paradox theory. This explanation focuses on the physiological effects of severe cold and a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. In late-stage hypothermia, victims sometimes remove clothing because they feel intensely hot, a misfiring of the body's temperature regulation. Some researchers suggest the group experienced a combination of environmental stress and hypothermia that led to irrational behavior. Perhaps a tent collapse from wind or snow caused initial panic. They fled partially dressed, intending to return quickly. But the cold worked faster than expected. Paradoxical undressing set in. The injuries in the ravine could have occurred from falls in their disoriented state. Strengths. Hypothermia is documented and deadly. Paradoxical undressing is real. The timeline fits. Weaknesses. This doesn't explain the tent cuts from inside. It doesn't explain why experienced hikers would flee so far without attempting to return immediately. And it struggles with the severity and pattern of the crush injuries, which don't match typical falling trauma. The katabatic wind theory. This is a more recent hypothesis proposed by researchers studying mountain microclimates. Katabatic winds are downslope winds created by cold air rapidly descending. In certain conditions, they can reach hurricane force with minimal warning. The theory suggests a sudden katabatic wind event struck the tent with such force that it caused structural damage, possibly even the internal injuries through extreme pressure changes or blunt impact from wind-driven snow and ice. The group, fearing the tent would be destroyed or that they'd be buried, cut their way out and descended to the forest to escape the wind corridor. But by the time they reached shelter, hypothermia had set in. Strengths. Katabatic winds are documented in the Urals. They can be violent and sudden. This explains the urgency and the descent trajectory. Weaknesses. Katabatic winds typically don't cause the kind of internal trauma documented, and experienced hikers would know to shelter in place during wind events, not flee downslope. Each theory explains some elements. None explains everything. The avalanche theory handles the injuries but struggles with hiker experience and slope angle. The infrasound theory handles the panic but not the physical trauma. The military theory lacks evidence. The hypothermia theory doesn't account for the tent damage. The wind theory has gaps in causation. So we return to the evidence itself. What do we know with certainty? The group left the tent urgently through cuts made from inside. They descended together to the forest. Some built a fire. Some attempted to return. 4 ended up in a ravine with severe traumatic injuries. All 9 died within hours. Something on that mountain on that night created a scenario where staying in the tent seemed more dangerous than facing certain death in the cold. What force could create that calculation in the minds of experienced mountaineers? In 2019, 60 years after 9 hikers died on Dead Mountain, the Russian government reopened the investigation. New forensic techniques, new modeling capabilities, new perspectives on old evidence. Their conclusion, published in 2020, supported the avalanche hypothesis, but they acknowledged significant uncertainties remained. The lead investigator stated publicly that while avalanche was the most probable explanation, we may never know with complete certainty what happened in those hours. That admission matters, because the truth about Dyatlov Pass may not be a single answer but a convergence of factors, environmental, physiological, circumstantial, that created a perfect storm of tragedy. Let's construct the most evidence-based scenario we can. February 1st, late afternoon. The group makes camp on an exposed slope, likely later than ideal. They're tired. They've been skiing all day. The decision to camp on the slope rather than in the forest below may have been about time, setting up in daylight rather than pushing on into darkness. A reasonable decision that becomes, in hindsight, fatal. They eat dinner. They settle in. The wind is strong but manageable. They've weathered worse. Sometime in the night, perhaps around midnight, perhaps later, something happens. The most credible explanation remains a snow slab collapse. Not a dramatic avalanche, but a localized failure of the snowpack they've disturbed by cutting into the slope. The weight of compacted snow strikes the tent. In darkness, in confusion with the tent collapsing around them and snow pouring in, they can't find the entrance. Someone makes a decision: cut through, get out, get to safety. They emerge into brutal cold, -30 degrees, possibly colder with wind chill. They're in sleeping clothes, some with minimal footwear. The immediate plan is simple: get away from the collapse zone, regroup, assess. But here's where the cascade begins. In darkness, on an exposed slope with wind and blowing snow, they can't see the tent clearly once they've moved away. Or perhaps they can see it but fear returning to another collapse. They make a collective decision: descend to the forest, wait out the immediate danger, return at first light. It's a decision that makes sense in the moment. The forest offers shelter from wind. They can build a fire. It's temporary. They don't realize how quickly the cold will work. They reach the cedar tree. The 2 Urals, perhaps the strongest or most willing, take charge of fire building. Others climb the tree for branches, desperate work with freezing hands. The fire lights, but it's inadequate. Not enough fuel, too much wind, too little shelter. The cold is relentless. At some point, perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps an hour, 3 members make the decision to return. Igor, Zina, Rustam. They're the leaders, the decision-makers. They'll retrieve clothing, supplies, bring them back. The others will maintain the fire. But hypothermia has already begun its work. The body shuts down from the extremities inward. Judgment fails. Motor control deteriorates. The 3 begin climbing, but they're moving slowly. Too slowly. Igor makes it 300 meters. He collapses, gripping a tree branch, trying to pull himself upward. His body simply stops. Zina makes it further, 150 meters closer to the tent. Her hands show desperate frostbite. She was trying, fighting. But the cold is absolute. Rustam falls between them. The small skull fracture suggests he may have stumbled, struck his head, continued briefly, then succumbed. Back at the cedar, the 2 Urals die by the failing fire. Their companions, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Kolvatov, Thibox-Brignol, are faced with a horrible calculus. The dead no longer need their clothing. They strip what they can. Pants, jackets, scraps of fabric. They redistribute it among themselves. They're trying to survive. They move into the ravine, perhaps seeking shelter from wind, perhaps following the drainage because it offers easier movement through deep snow. Or perhaps they're simply disoriented, hypothermic, losing coherent thought. And here, the second catastrophe occurs. The most probable explanation for their injuries is a fall onto rocks or ice hidden beneath snow. The ravine had a small stream, frozen but with irregular surfaces. A collapse of a snow bridge. A fall of several meters onto unforgiving ground. Or possibly, as the 2021 Avalanche study suggests, a second, smaller snow release in the ravine itself. The force required to create bilateral rib fractures and skull trauma is significant, but a fall from height onto ice can generate such force, especially if multiple people fell together, or if the snow collapsed beneath them. Thibault-Brignol's skull fracture would have caused rapid unconsciousness. Dubinina and Zolotaryov, with their chest trauma, would have struggled to breathe, gone into shock. Kolvatov may have tried to help or simply succumbed to cold alongside them. They died in the ravine, buried by falling snow, hidden until spring melt revealed them 3 months later. This scenario requires no exotic phenomena, no military intervention, no infrasound or psychological warfare, just a series of decisions, each reasonable in isolation, that compound into tragedy. A camping spot chosen for convenience, a snow slab that releases, a flight into cold, a belief that they can survive until morning, the brutal mathematics of hypothermia, a fall in darkness. But we must acknowledge what we don't know. We don't know for certain what caused them to cut the tent. We don't know why they didn't return immediately. We can't fully explain the pattern of injuries or rule out other contributing factors. The evidence is incomplete, filtered through time, weather, and the limitations of 1959 forensic science. What we do know is this: 9 experienced, capable people died in conditions they understood and respected. They made decisions that seemed rational in crisis but proved fatal. They tried to save each other, stripping clothing from the dead, attempting rescue climbs, building fire, seeking shelter. They were not reckless. They were not unprepared. They were human beings facing circumstances that exceeded their capacity to survive. The last photograph recovered from their cameras shows the group on the afternoon of February 1st, setting up the tent. They're squinting against bright snow. Some are smiling. They look tired but confident. They're doing what they loved, pushing into wilderness, testing themselves against the mountains. Behind them, the slope of Khalat-Syekh rises into white sky. In a few hours, they'll be gone. Yuri Yudin, the friend who turned back, lived until 2013. He spent 54 years carrying the weight of survival, wondering if his presence would have changed anything. He gave countless interviews, supported investigations, visited the pass multiple times. In his final years, he said he'd made peace with not knowing exactly what happened. "They were my friends," he said. "They were strong, they were smart, they loved the mountains. Sometimes the mountains take even the best of us. That's not mystery, that's nature." Dyatlov Pass remains a place of pilgrimage. Hikers still make the journey. They stand where the tent stood. They descend to the cedar. They visit the ravine. And they wonder, as we all wonder, what those final hours felt like. What decisions seemed right in the moment. What hope remained even as the cold closed in. We may never have complete certainty, but we have enough evidence to understand this. What happened on Dead Mountain was likely not supernatural, not conspiratorial, not inexplicable. It was tragedy, human, comprehensible, and all the more haunting for being so. The wind still blows across Khalat-Syekh. The snow still falls. The mountain keeps its silence, and 9 young people remain forever on its slopes. Their story a reminder that even experience, even preparation, even courage cannot always save us from the indifferent forces of the natural world. That is the mystery. Not what happened, but that it happened at all.